here's the part in the conversation we might get into a little trouble. I was talking to someone a few weeks ago about this idea of, this instant admit craze, the instant admit, instant admit, instant admit. And I've made the argument, I said, I don't think this is aging very well. I think initially when it was introduced, like all things with all the best intentions, but as we kind of look back at the attrition rate of those cohorts, as we look back at the kind of debt they rake up in the first 2 years and then drop out, I just think we could do a better job at understanding how we get students in.
Higher education is under unprecedented pressure. Financial, cultural, competitive. These forces are pushing universities to act like factories, to fill seats, chase numbers, and to survive another year. But the institutions that will thrive are transforming into communities, places where students feel seen, known, and inspired to belong. Factories won't survive. Communities will. Exceptional leaders are building this future right now. Their stories can light the way for others. This is the Factories to Communities transformation, and these are the architects of belonging.
Rock, yeah, thank you for joining us on our video series called Architects of Belonging. We're recording this right now. It's the first week of November, so we're over halfway through the semester. I guess we're starting to walk ourselves towards kind of the end of the calendar year. But how are you doing? What's happening up on the Upper East Coast?
Things here in Ithaca are going well. We came off of a really good recruitment campaign this current cycle. We beat expectations. As of this morning, we're about 45% ahead in applications compared to last year. About a year ago, we had about 3,000 applications. A year later, we're up about 5,500 applications. So it's a good launch. We know that, there's still a lot of game left to play. This is probably halfway through the first quarter, and we still have to work on bringing them in. I think with respect to a lot of the conversations we've had, a lot of the planning, a lot of the intentionality around reimagining our campaign structure, we're starting to bear fruit. I think there are some tweaks that still need to be made, but I think all teams, along with campus stakeholders, are definitely rowing in the right direction. So all is well here on South Hill at Ithaca College. Yeah.
Good. Well, so yeah, so it sounds like you're earning your holiday breaks that are upcoming then. Yeah. So yeah.
True.
Well, look, myself and Lungi, we're super excited to have you on. We've had a number of conversations with you over the past, I guess, the calendar year, right? And some of them even in person. We saw you in San Diego, which was great. But we're having you on today because, in particular, we want to talk about how you're building belonging and community at Ithaca. It's really kind of the core concept of what we're trying to get out of this. We're going to explore a few other things, though, to that. We're going to explore your personal why for what you're doing in higher ed and also how you're leading through what is, honestly, one of the most transformative and also challenging eras in higher ed. In terms of intro, though, so you've been a lifer in higher ed from you were a student from undergrad up to Doctor of Ed. You've had a career in higher ed that has spanned 6 institutions, private, public, you name it. But tell us a little bit, who is Rock Hall outside of the LinkedIn intro, that as we call it?
I would like to think that I am a guy who maybe wasn't the best at all things, but showed up at all events. As mentioned, I was a first generation college student. Back in the 1900s, that's when I graduated, 1992. Graduating from high school and going into college in the early 90s, it was a busy time. We talk a lot about the current state of affairs. If you dial the clock back to the 90s, very similar types of energies were at play. We were talking about healthcare disparities, housing disparities. We were talking about this idea about equality well before equity was ever even a buzzword. And so walking in as a first generation student, everything presented to me was just brand new. Being on a college campus, living on my own within a dormitory, having essentially neighbors within the residence halls who are all your age, but from around the globe. It kind of changed some of your thinking. And I think beginning there, I started to understand the importance of nuance and differences. Fast forwarding a bit, I got my degree in broadcast journalism, worked briefly for a small CBS station in Northern California. And soon after then, I kind of got introduced back into higher education. My alma mater, Cal Poly Humboldt, they hired me to shoot and produce recruitment videos. And so as I was shooting and producing recruitment videos, working with students, interviewing students, Vice President at the time, Dr. Edward Buzz Webb, he kind of tapped me on the shoulder and he said, "Hey, would you consider doing this full time?" And as crazy as it sounds, when I graduated, I was working for a small CBS station. I was shooting recruitment videos, and I was also doing stand-up comedy on the side. So higher education was paying much better than all three of those combined. And so I packed up my bags and I pivoted and I started working within the academy formally. And that took me from Cal Poly Humboldt to William Patterson State University in New Jersey. From there to the University of Southern California. I think that's where the zenith of my career is kind of encapsulated. I was there for about 13 years. I learned quite a bit. And then from the University of Southern California to the University of Utah, from there to Arcadia University, and now Ithaca College. So, I would think that my story has been the one of best outcomes given the scenario.
Yeah, that's awesome, Rock. Thanks for that. I had no idea you were in stand-up comedy. That's an awesome tidbit. And an important question that I think people want to know: who's taller between you and Magic Johnson when you met him?
That was such a great meeting. It's rare that you meet real life superheroes. And when I was a kid, Magic was my real life Superman. He had that afro. Back then, you wore the socks up to your kneecaps. And meeting him was almost an out of body experience. I joked with him. I said, Magic, my mom loves me more than anything under the sun. You can name it, and my mom loves me the most. Until it comes to you. I said, my mom loves you more than she loves me. And Magic started cracking up, and he says, I hear that a lot. I said, I bet you do. But to answer your question, despite who my mom's love more, I think Magic might have had me by an inch or two. I think he did.
Yeah, well, that's okay, because when we were in when we were in San Diego, there was a running joke among people that if you just walked into the expo hall and you scanned the crowd, you would find Rock pretty quickly. So it's okay. You can give the nod away. There was a couple thousand people that were running that joke. So
right on, man.
Well, Rock, the first thing we want to kind of jump into here, and this is going to set the foundation for what we're going to talk about, is your why, and really in particularly, what is a challenging era. So as we've said before, and as you've noted as well, colleges are closing right now. The belief in value, or even the ROI of higher ed is declining. It's kind of almost as if the essence of higher education at this point in time is really being questioned by a lot of people. So the first question we want to talk about is, what is your why that's really fueling your commitment as a higher education leader today?
Man, that's a fantastic question. My why goes back to my earlier statement. Being a first generation kid, going through the ebbs and flows of life, trying to position yourself for success or acknowledgement at each stage, working towards a degree, paying down bills, trying to create a family. A lot of my why is kind of encapsulated in that story because I think it resonates for a lot of people. And not only first generation, you could be legacy, you could be second generation, you could be well-to-do. I think the beauty about colleges and universities is that it changes the trajectory of your life experience, but it also broadens and expands your understanding of the world. And of all the things that we do within life, I think one of the most easily forgivable things is that of trying to educate someone else. I might be slightly more successful and have a little more money if I sold Ferraris, but I don't think it would be as gratifying as seeing a young person enter through a college, walk across the stage, and then at my phase in my life, 10, 15, 20 years later, they're calling you with their own family. They're calling you with the medical degree. They're calling you with a law degree. And on the phone, they are thanking you to the world's end for what you did for them. But in reality, they did it themselves. And you simply provided a pathway and a platform for them to do it. So I think in that regard, my why is as altruistic as can be within this space, simply trying to help young people get into college and go to school. As a vice president, as a chief enrollment management officer, we have targets, we have budgets, we have all of that. But I think at the crux of what we do is really about the human story, the human component, and really trying to help people be a little bit better than they were before. and maybe help them understand themselves a little bit better than they were before.
Yeah, and that's it is altruistic, it is beautiful, it's personal. It's something that you cherish from your own experience as well. Wondering if it's evolved over time, Rock, because we as Tim was saying, we're seeing some challenges within higher ed that some people haven't seen in this industry before. I know you've seen a lot of cycles, but what has your why evolved over time, and has it evolved specifically to this time, that in this challenging era that we're in?
If there's one thing that keeps me up at night, broadly speaking, it's how are we going to get this right? How are we going to be equitable? How are we going to be fair? How are we going to be successful in building the type of campus that we want to create? I think every campus says they're unique, and some have better fountains, some have bigger buildings, and that's fair. But in all honesty, I think what makes colleges unique are the young people that come in each and every year to populate the hallways. Some are from the country, some are from the city, some are, blue voting, some are red voting, some are liberal, some are conservative, some are gay and queer, some are straight. We need that. We need all of those voices within hallways, classrooms, debate halls, because at a certain point, they're going to have to launch into the greater fold of the world, and it's going to be up to them to make this place better.
Okay, I do want to take one step backwards for a minute here. As we a lot of people probably recognize, like for most leaders in higher education, the foundation of what you're talking about here, the foundation of your why, the fueling of your commitment, it actually probably, like their first experience in higher ed was actually when they were a student. And you've talked about so far being a first generation student. You talked about that fond memory you had of doing the video production, and then someone kind of talked you into, wanting to work full time. And maybe it's just that, but like, is there a first memory, or is there a feeling that comes to mind for you when you were a student? And that could be an undergrad, master's, your doctorate, where you really started to think like, wow, this being in higher ed is something where I feel like I belong and where I want to potentially have my career.
Yeah. I'll dial it back a little further than that. I was in, I think, 7th or 8th grade. And I was in a decent school, really good, people worked there, really kind people worked there. But we were having this conversation about, what's your future? What are you going to do in life? And there was a counselor who was talking to me, and she was a very, very nice lady. And I thought very highly of her. And she was telling me, oh, there's the military. You can become a fireman. You can become a policeman. You can, Forest Service. And I'm kind of like, oh, yeah, that sounds really good. And as soon as she turned the corner, this man who I think very highly of, Mr. Lee, his name was Mr. Lee, he put his hand on my shoulder and he basically said, hey, no, that was great advice, but you're going to college. Have you heard about college? And outside of athletics, at that point I was 7th, 8th grade. So, scouts weren't looking for me at that time. And so he took me to his office and he sat me down and he put college brochures in front of me. And he said, well, this is a college and here's what it means to be a part of a college. He says, I went to college and here's what I do. And I think that conversation, what are you in 7th and 8th grade? 13 maybe? 12 maybe? I think that conversation that early cemented in me this idea of mentorship, this idea of higher education, this idea of, and there's nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong with firemen and cops and, but this idea that maybe you can think a little differently. And so for me, it really took place in middle school. Mr. David Lee, he was my counselor. And soon after, he introduced me to Mrs. Lillian Adams, another counselor, who kind of took me under their wing and nurtured me. And so I think it was that standpoint, I knew that that was an option. Now, between friends, I still wanted to be a fireman. I really did. But soon after, we started talking more about higher ed, and that kind of caused me to pivot a bit more and maybe broaden my stance a bit more.
These mentors and the people around you were kind of fostering this belief in higher education. What was the moment when you got into higher education where you were like, this is where I belong? like I'm in the right place? Was there a particular moment that you can remember or think back to?
Okay. There are two moments in college. At Cal Poly Humboldt, I had a professor, Mrs. Chinello, and she was my English professor. And, I think like most young writers, I wasn't cursed. I just had a young brain, like most young people. And, my writing was all over the place. It went north, south, east, and west, no matter the topic. I was just everywhere. And Mrs. Chinello, she sat me down and she says, you know what? You see a lot of good stuff, but you have to focus. And no one, no one in my K-12 upbringing ever asked me this, but she was the first person to ask me, how much do you read? And at that point, I had some really great comic books, and I kind of dug into those. And she challenged me to start reading long form. She says, your writing will get better the more that you read. If you're a good reader, you become a good writer, you become a good speaker. She says, you have something here that you could master in time, but you really have to tap into it now. And so she gave me 3 books to read and she held me to them. I did not want to read these books, but she held me to them and she'd see me. Did you read this chapter? What did it say? What did this say? And for the first time, this idea of discipline, this idea of really sitting down and locking into something long term and problem solving started to kind of gain root. And that, kind of took off for me. I think the second point of this was probably my junior or senior year in college. Again, I had started doing some local stand-up comedy circuits. Was having a fair amount of success, with the microphone and just connecting with folk. I was interning at the local CBS station. And again, Dr. Buzz Webb tapped me on the shoulder about shooting the recruitment videos. But more importantly, he talked to me about, the profession of higher education. And he says, I think you can do this. And, he says, but you have to understand, if you're getting into this, you have to be a vice president. You have to grow within this field. He says, for you to land and stay in the same place does no one any good. So when you enter this profession, make the right moves and steps, but you really want to have a North Star of being a vice president. And that was another conversation that just cemented me. And Buzz Webb, he used to take me through mock interviews before I knew what those were. He used to sit down and kind of, question and answer with me, to get my cadence of tone. Dennis Hart was another person within college. He was my broadcast journalism professor. Dennis Hart was another person who told me, read in the mirror, look at yourself in the mirror reading, understand what you're saying. He says, if you can take an idea from here, put it here and affect someone over there, you've done something. But the fact that in that moment they were with me and they saw me, going back to this idea of belonging, I think the first part of belonging is being accepted, and they accepted me, and it changed my life.
Yeah. And Ruck, one thing that Lungi and I always love is on LinkedIn, you post you have your musings that you signed
Yes.
out. You had mentioned that one time there was a student that was talking to you and had mentioned that one day they wanted to be a VP of enrollment. How do you channel this experience that you had as a student and what kind of your elders were saying to you? But now the role is reversed. You're that Mr. Lee to that student. What do you say to that student?
I think with young people, the first thing I try to do is listen. I'm 51, and a lot of guys my age talk a lot. And it's okay. We should. I'm not disparaging anyone. But I think with young people, again, part of being accepted is this idea of being heard. And me understanding my upbringing, understanding kind of my walks, in my mentorship, I really sit and listen at length about everything. The good, the bad, maybe some things I shouldn't hear, but it's okay. And then from then, we try to create this understanding of respect, trust, and dual believability. Do you believe in me? Because I believe in you. And here's how we work it. Going back to the young man I was talking to about the VP position, I saw so much of me and him in that moment. You always kind of know you want to do better, but the question is, how do I do better? And so I think listening, understanding, digesting, understanding where they are in that moment in time. But then beyond that, creating calls to action and charges. Charge them to do something, charge them to read something, charge them to accomplish something, and then come back. I think the most healthiest exchanges are those when you set an expectation and you have to have the person deliver. I think early in my career, I gave some really great talks, but there were no calls to action. There were no charges to action. And so you always kind of wondered, how the young person did or didn't walk away. I think within the mentorship to create challenges and calls to action are really helpful. And that's one thing I've adopted now when I work with young people. And kind of like Mrs. Chinello, when, I see them, hey, did you read that? Did you look at it? What do you think? And again, it shows them, oh, he sees me, he understands me, I belong here, I matter, I can do this. I think when you show young people that you believe in them, even if they're imperfect, and 99% of the time they are, I think that's just a solid foundation for not only a good mentorship, but what could potentially be a lifelong friendship.
Awesome. Well, we want to bring it up to the present day here, and talk a little bit about some of the pressures and the challenges. So you said before that higher education is in flux, and we see that as well. From our perspective, many institutions are feeling forced into what we call this factory model, where there is this short-term pressure to just try to chase the numbers, chase the yield, chase the outcomes to survive another year. Would be curious to hear what does that pressure look like? Maybe how does it show up, and how do you feel that on a day to day, or maybe even just like within the past cycle or few cycles?
Yeah, the pressure, it's there, it's real. You know, for gals and guys in my position, you're brought into a team, and chances are there's a 5, 7, 10-year history of declension or just instability. The hope is that whatever you bring to the table, you have the ability to fix it right now. We've had 7 years of this craziness. What can you do within one campaign cycle to make it better? So I think the first thing to do is that you have to level set and manage expectations. You have to really understand the data, show a 5 to 7, ideally a 10-year snapshot of enrollment trends. When were you up? When were you down? When did you start to kind of drift from your top mark, and go below? I think, and again, going back to partnerships, I'm extremely lucky to have a president like Dr. Cornish, who is very curious about the enrollment process. She's very curious about best ways to leverage equity across the platforms and bring people in. She's very intentional about student diversity on all fronts, liberal, conservative, left, right, gay, straight, black, white, young, poor. When you have a conversation with someone who has that kind of a posture, that kind of a stance, I think it is easy to build out strategy. I've worked for presidents before who kind of had a you fix it, get it done model. Whatever it takes, just get it done. And those are trickier because when you do fall short or when something doesn't go as planned, the automatic assumption is you didn't fix it. You couldn't do it. And a lot like, I joke with friends, if you're an enrollment VP, you're probably similar to a college coach. You probably get 1 to 3 seasons to get it right. If you can build a team, if you can execute a play, if you can bring home the goal, chances are you'll get another season. But if you don't, chances are you'll have to find another team or an academic home. And so I think this idea of level setting, this idea of understanding the data, this idea of working with a team of people who are equally as curious as you about really creating something that's sustainable and scalable. Most quick fixes aren't sustainable or scalable. And here's a part of the conversation we might get into a little trouble. I was talking to someone a few weeks ago about this idea of, this instant admit craze, the instant admit, instant admit, instant admit. And I've made the argument, I said, I don't think this is aging very well. I think initially when it was introduced, like all things with all the best intentions, but as we kind of look back at the attrition rate of those cohorts, as we look back at the kind of debt they rake up in the first 2 years and then drop out, I just think we could do a better job at understanding how we get students in. Now, part of that instant admit phenomenon, again, my words, mine personally, I think it was a quick fix to a long-term issue. And again, whenever you have a quick fix, it's not sustainable. and it's not scalable. I think a better approach is understanding your current markets, your core markets, your historical markets, your expansion markets. I think a better strategy is really getting back into the relationship building game, getting counselors back on your campus, having certain members of this campus go out and meet with people within certain regions and around the world. Broadly speaking, I'm not a huge fan of quick fixes because, again, I just don't think they age well.
Yeah, and it's okay if I get in trouble, I think, but I'm gonna double down on, on something that you just said. So we call it, as Tim said, it's a factory response of just let's ramp up the numbers, or let's focus on the numbers, short-term gains. And what I'm hearing, and it doesn't have to be from you, but even something like the early admits, the focus was to just get people admitted and get those numbers up as quickly, well-intentioned, but
Yeah.
Get those numbers up, and it's a short-term gain, which is what we would call a factory response. That's what I'm hearing from you as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think, my term, I use a Legionnaire's approach to wholesale, you know. Um, not to pick on it, but let's pick on it. Going back to those instant admits, you're working with a population that traditionally has been underserved. They come from underserved neighborhoods. There might be one counselor for 700 students. Mom or dad might work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, not even, splurge, but just to keep the lights on. And then a letter lands from so-and-so university that says you're admitted. Not only are you admitted, we're going to give you $35,000. Not only are we going to give you $35,000, we're going to guarantee you housing in one of the dorms. Again, on the front end, it sounds good. But if you come from a family who lacks the cultural capital, who lacks maybe some of the intellectual capital or know how to understand what that means, immediately you think, God, this is my golden ticket. Let me grab onto this. And then you land on the campus. And that $35,000 has another $27,000 gap at the end of it. And of that $27,000 gap with federal and state aid, you might have got another $12,000. That still leaves $15,000 on the table. For some people, $15,000 might as well be $15 million because they don't understand how to piece that together. And so I think you're right. This factory approach, it removes the student from the center, and you're more so going for targets and outcomes. We have to hit this enrollment target. We have to hit this budget target, which, again, that's not a bad business practice, but how do you create an architecture to do that is sustainable?
Yeah. And then let's go to the alternative. We believe in what we call a community response, and that, I think you just said it in that answer as well, of putting the student in the center. And we certainly believe that the universities and colleges that will weather down the storms through this time and thrive and like do well are the ones that have this student-centric community response. What does that mean to you, Rock?
I think student-centric, and an old term that's coming back into vogue, this idea of holistic approaches. I've always argued when you recruit the student, you have to recruit the family and the mom and the dad. It's a little easier if there's legacy there. Some schools have more legacy than others. Some schools have next to none. But I believe, a healthy ecosystem, you'll have a dual comm stream. You'll have a comm stream for students that, educates, uplifts, informs, and directs. And then you'll have a comm stream for parents that enlightens, informs, and gives them touch points for direction. I think understanding the family dynamic and where the family sits is a great way to go about it. I've worked at institutions before where I've landed, and 98% of all comms go directly to student email boxes. And we all know lovingly that's where ideas go to die. And so, how do you build out a parent comm to support the student comm? That way, if the student ignores it, chances are mom and dad aren't going to ignore an Ithaca College, a University of Southern California, a Cal Poly Humboldt email. They'll say, oh, this is from a college or university. At minimum, let me read the first paragraph. And so I think this idea of community and belonging, you really have to understand the student and where they are, but you really have to try to capture parent data, email data, cell phone data, and also start building out the relationship with the parent. Overwhelmingly, parents have great influence on where their students go. And this idea that you would execute a marketing recruitment campaign and not include the parents on that, at worst is a bit short-sighted.
Yeah. And Ruck, you had mentioned a few times in this call about the value in higher education, kind of the shared experience, the shared thought, talking about different races, different identities, different socioeconomic backgrounds, like the beauty of bringing all of these people together. How do you think about bringing those students to campus? But beyond the recruiting, the retention's a huge component of it. You've mentioned that before. And how do you think about actually building a community where all of those different type of people, they do feel like they belong to it? Like that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not. I think onboarding is so important. How do you onboard a student? Usually within enrollment management, we talk about the recruitment funnel. Get them in at the top, nurture them, get them out at the bottom, and, kind of hand them over to student affairs. Here, President Cornish, she created a leadership tier where there's dotted lines. There's a dotted line from enrollment to student success. There's a dotted line from enrollment to marketing, from enrollment to academics. And there are a lot of really intentional conversations all throughout the campaign about, okay, here's where we are, here's what we anticipate, how can we capture the class? And so I think understanding your student dynamic, where they're coming from, kind of their makeup, what schools they sit in, is one way to do it. But also, too, my partner in crime, Dr. B, this idea of building affinity, building affinity within the residence halls, building affinity within certain spaces where students, even among different majors and programs and disciplines, they can all gather around a certain worldly issue or a certain cyclical concern, whether it's world hunger, whether it's housing insecurity, whether it's, single mothers changing their ways. I think, again, this idea of charging young people to do something, charging young people to correct a cyclical evil, holding them to task to kind of research something. As they're onboarding, it does create this sense of belonging.
Yeah, that's worthwhile endeavor. I think Tim was saying it is a difficult thing to do, but I think the approach, that you're telling us about here, it is worthwhile because of just the melting pot of all the types of students that are there that can impact the world, as you put it. So in the last couple of minutes here, Rock, will do not necessarily quick fire, but a couple of questions that are semi quick fire. First one is, when you think about your legacy, what do you want future students, staff to say about LEAD?
Wow, love that one. Gotta be quick. I would like to think that people would say that he was curious, he was compassionate, and that he cared. Imperfect as all get out, but he was curious, compassionate, and that he cared.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, you're already hitting those with us, with Tim and I. So you're on a great path to creating your legacy. And then the second one is there any other leader that you admire, or someone that you think we should bring in this video series that you think is an architect of belonging themselves?
Oh, I would say off the bat, President Cornish, and that's kind of an easy call, some would argue. But in all seriousness, leadership boils down to styles. And I've worked for leaders who had vastly different styles of leadership. If we're talking mindfulness, if we're talking peak curiosity, President Cornish is one of those people who, she gets it. I'll give her a slide deck. She'll catch a data point that was off by a decimal point from slide 5, from slide 7. She'll say, this looks good, but these 2 data points are off. Is that what you're trying to say? And I'm thinking, oh goodness, I missed it, and I'll go and fix it. Or we'll be in conversations and we'll talk about certain marketing campaigns or certain academic endeavors. And she'll always say, well, how does it relate to enrollment? How does it relate to advancement? How does it relate to student affairs and campus life? I think that type of leader is extremely rare. And, given her personal makeup, she is a professed, proud, queer female president. And, I can only imagine the amount of pressure on her on a daily basis from all sides. And her ability to manage it with such grace is impressive. So I would say definitely President Cornish. A really good friend of mine, Dr. Latoro Yates. He's a really good guy, a very mindful leader at Kean University. Dr. Yates is a great guy. Nathan Faust at UConn, University of Connecticut. Nate is just a solid dude. I could rattle names at exhaustion, but those are probably three. I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, awesome. So what you might not know is that Tim and I will hunt these people down and try to get them on this video series as architects as well.
Sounds good, man.
Yeah. And then the last one, you took the challenge, Factories to Communities challenge. Any thoughts on that challenge and anything that came up for you?
My rating was belonging leader. I think that's pretty decent. I'm not sure what the other categories were.
That's the best one, Rock.
Oh, right on, man. Yeah. Again, a guy who showed up, a guy who cared, a guy who was imperfect, but who tried to make it right. I tell my team, we're all just moments in time. This is our moment in time. How can we make it better? There were teams before us. There'll be teams after us. Within this moment in time, how do we make it better? And, I think some of the questioning on that test spoke to that.
Awesome. Well, Rock, I think this is probably a good stopping point, but man, it's always a good conversation with you. I know we've had a handful, and they never cease to amaze. So, first of all, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Really honored that you're our guest on the Architects of Belonging, and we're looking forward to hopefully seeing you again in person. I know we were in San Diego in 6 months ago, and hopefully we have another in-person meeting at some point in the future here.
I'm looking forward to it, man. First round's on me. I hope to see you good brothers soon in the near future. And thank you for inviting me back. And I'm always happy to show up and break bread.
Awesome. Well, we'll use your sign off. Be well.
Be well.